It seems like for every single show or movie that exists, especially in the animated medium, there is inevitably some sort of massive theory that gains a lot of popularity that everything happening in the story is all taking place in one of the characters' heads. These days, this sort of theory has been discussed so much that most people reject it outright and even think of it as a bit cringe. But it's hard to deny that these sorts of theories got so popular for all these different shows because of how dark they can be and how it changes the way we look at our own lives. These theorists take shows like Rugrats, Fairly OddParents, and other childhood favorites and try to take consistent inconsistencies in their narrative to point towards a second version of the story where our main characters are just crazy, or at the very least, imagining things in order to make themselves feel better. But why is that? Well, cartoons, especially for children, are inherently fantastical. Cartoons can aim to be grounded, but animation as a medium reduces an experience to symbols that don't adhere to reality. Animation, for instance, rarely shows you what a person looks like. Instead, when you draw a person, it's just the idea of what that person looks like when you imagine the key details. Because of that, animation tends to take on, even more than other mediums, a sort of inherent fantasy to it. Even when the characters live in a grounded enough world, like in the animated series Doug, everything has the otherworldly logic of a child's perspective. Cartoons often emphasize what children find weird about the world based on things they don't quite understand yet, and like with fantasy cartoons, this tends to create an in-world metaphor for a child's real-life experience. It's because of this that even non-fantasy based cartoons can make you feel like you're seeing a child's interpretation of reality instead of the reality of that child itself. At the end of the day, cartoons are supposed to be somewhat fantastical versions of real-life stories that kids can relate to, so it's easy to come to the conclusion on some of these shows that what the kids are experiencing that we see is really all in their heads. So today, let's talk about some of the most interesting versions of this theory that has been mass applied to almost every cartoon and even other media. Part 1, Fairly OddParents. The key reason I wanted to talk about this theory is because recently I found someone applying the idea to the show The Fairly OddParents, and it was a surprisingly comfortable fit. As most of you know, The Fairly OddParents is about a young boy who has a terrible life, and because of that, he's given fairy godparents that can grant his every wish. But according to this type of theory, this is just a coping mechanism Timmy has to deal with his life, which is even worse than what we see on camera. This basic premise led to many seasons, sequels, and a spin-off series in the world, all built around the very thing we are talking about today in its most literal form, childhood wish fulfillment. With Fairly OddParents, each episode is supposed to explore the mind of what a kid would do if they could have just about anything, even if the show often became more about not actually being able to get what you want and trying to create some more complicated wish in order to achieve something similar, but then failing. The most common example of this I remember is Timmy not being able to interfere with true love, but that doesn't stop him from making wishes that are technically within the rules in order to try and get love or ruin it for someone else. Generally, this would end with Timmy realizing that this wish was a huge mistake, and wishing for things to go back to normal in order to undo the damage that he had done to people and even the planet. And it's because of this formula in particular that the idea that it's all in Timmy's head starts to make a little bit of sense. The theory, when applied to Fairly OddParents, is that Timmy's godparents, Cosmo and Wanda, never existed at all, and that everything we see is more so Timmy's imagination and childhood play. Later shows would lean into this kind of idea entirely, like Craig of the Creek, where conflicts are just petty children's fights projected against a child's imagination to make it feel more grand than it is, reflecting the seriousness inside the child's head for their more personal problems. And while watching Fairly OddParents, at least the early seasons, it's easy to see how that logic might fit here. Timmy's life is horrible, so why wouldn't he retreat into his imagination? It makes sense that a child suffering like this would come up with stories where they are important and have great power. But if you're going to pretend to have the power to make any wish that can change the world, you're eventually going to have to rationalize why you can't make any lasting changes to your life. In every episode, Timmy has to ultimately undo whatever wish he made in order for things to return to the way they are, generally presenting Earth and life on Earth as a place of misery, with Timmy being at the bottom of its hierarchy in his community. His parents don't treat him right, and we laugh at it, but the point of Vicky is straight up that Timmy was being hurt by an adult who was trusted to take care of him, and he'd go to school to get more trauma from his bullies and his teachers. Many episodes deal with Timmy trying to change these specific dynamics, trying to wish for a world where his parents treat him better, where Vicky is kind or even just not there at all, and where the kids at school are nice to him. But in the end, something always goes wrong with these wishes, and whether through consequences of the change or Timmy's own empathy for how he has affected others, he always chooses to revert things back to the way they were. So from the outside perspective, it's almost as if there are no fairy godparents at all, and that he just imagines what life could be before eventually coming to the conclusion that life has to be the way it is because his role in it maintains the balance. The story in this theory is just Timmy imagining a better life for himself each day and then rationalizing that he can't have that, often with Timmy writing off someone else's emotional state as being more important than his, even when it requires him to be the victim in their story that keeps them going. The way this story would play out is less like Craig of the Creek as a whole, where the kids are aware of their imaginative play, and more like the character specifically known as Sparkle Cadet, who I always felt was a very realistic look at long-term childhood imaginative play. You see, Sparkle Cadet was like Timmy Turner in that they both had lives that just weren't making them happy. For Sparkle Cadet, this wasn't because of the people that surrounded her, but because she moved around a lot, and because of that, didn't really have a strong support system outside of her parents. She wasn't able to make friends very easily with how often she moved, and that made her feel unimportant. A lot of children cope with this by having imaginative play that they don't call imagination. They pretend it to be real, and they try to commit to the bit full time. For Sparkle Cadet, her story was that she was a superhero who fights evil, and that is why her family has to move so much, so she can fight the evil all over the world or galaxy as it was in her head. This is essentially the idea that some fans want to apply to Fairly OddParents and even other shows, that the character is just emotionally dealing with reality itself, and we're seeing that as the show. But as we said before, the point of children's shows is generally wish fulfillment blended with a reminder that there is a reality that we can't change with magic. It's about showing kids what would happen if they did get their way so that they can better deal with reality in the way it is. With Fairly OddParents, I wouldn't say there's any real evidence, however, that this is all in Timmy's head. And the problem with these theories is that they don't really account for the thematic or deep storytelling, which doesn't rely on a twist, but inherently tackles those issues within the framework of its literal narrative. Cosmo and Wanda don't have to be imaginary friends to make the story of Fairly OddParents work, as it's meant to be a literal interpretation of the child audience's mind, not a metaphorical interpretation of Timmy Turner's own character. However, there are a lot of shows where this logic is applied a lot more lazily and even forcefully inserting this theory. Part 2, Adventure Time. Perhaps the worst example of this theory, in my opinion at least, has been when people try to apply this logic to shows like Adventure Time. All these children's shows do try to capture some sort of essence of childhood in its grander story, and that's basically the starting point to try and rewrite the world in the fandom's mind to be just some sort of fake story in the main character's head, but this makes terrible sense in Adventure Time. For Adventure Time, the only reason people really think this is because the show is about a boy and his dog. This is a classic children's entertainment dynamic, particularly for boys. And dogs are great, but when a kid spends more time with a dog than other people, it generally means that they are a very lonely child. And because of that, some fans want to think that the entire story of Adventure Time is just Finn playing a game of imagination with his dog, occasionally running into other kids he imagines as princesses, monsters, and Candy Kingdom civilians, because he mostly spends time alone and has to rationalize that there's no one around him. When it comes to the theory of an entire story being in the main character's head, however, it's not limited to just being the kid's imagination. The most popular theory when it comes to Adventure Time, as far as I'm aware at least, isn't that Finn is just imagining the story while playing with his dog, but that he's imagining the entire thing from within a coma. Basically taking the imaginative play he had with his best friend, his dog Jake, and imagining the rest of his life being that way in a surreal childhood dreamscape. The coma theory is perhaps the most popular iteration of the it was all in their head theory for a lot of shows, but it's also the most downright lazy. A story that sets out to use this idea still could do it in a good way, and these twists are more about how they're attached to a longer narrative than the twist itself. But as a theory, it's been so overused and applied to just about every cartoon, and even a lot of live-action shows and movies without any need. And that's exactly how it feels with Adventure Time. With the Fairly OddParent version of this theory, you had someone who very specifically was going back to a normal life at the end of each episode, and even at the end of the series, when Timmy would have to give up his fairy godparents and even lose his memories of them, as if they never even existed in his life. But any theory that would rely on the idea that the main character has just been sleeping this entire time without any evidence that they're actually sleeping within the show just feels lazy to me. And because of this, the theory that it was all in Finn's head or that he's in a coma just isn't interesting to me the way it can be for other shows. The way it was for Fairly OddParents, or even Courage the Cowardly Dog. Part 3, Courage the Cowardly Dog. Courage the Cowardly Dog is one of the first cartoons I remember hearing associated with this theory that it's all in the main character's head. In this case, the character being Courage, the Cowardly Dog. And what makes this theory so fun is that it's based on the idea that the show really is just from the perspective of a dog. Courage was a unique show about a dog living in the middle of nowhere with strange, creepy things happening in each episode. There were seeming ghosts, aliens, curses, and just about anything strange and supernatural. It's a show I honestly might want to do a bigger breakdown for at one point, but for today's video, the theory is basically that the world only seems as scary as it does in Courage because it's from the perspective of a dog. And even if you don't have a dog, you can understand how this makes sense, as dogs will bark at anyone as they come over, no matter how friendly or familiar they are, because they see anything outside of their norm as an absolute threat. It's because of this that some fans believe that every threat faced by Courage is actually just a normal human experience that Courage imagines to be terrifying because he's an animal. Like most dogs, he has a favorite human, which is his owner Muriel, but he also has a negative human in his life who hates him, Muriel's husband Eustace. Every episode leans into the idea that Courage is projecting his fears onto situations, with Courage becoming scared and seeing random creepy visuals surrounding his anxieties. So already within the narrative itself, we have Courage imagining things that aren't there, giving us the hint that the things we do see later are just him exaggerating what he's experiencing still. The thing Courage is most scared of is his negative human Eustace, who goes out of his way to try and scare Courage, leading to a vicious cycle of Courage being on edge and not understanding what is safe and what isn't. While Eustace often puts on some sort of mask to scare Courage himself, Courage even sees his face warp and become more terrifying as he does with things in general, meaning nothing he actually faces has to be supernatural, weird, or even actually creepy. It also doesn't mean that the threats he saves his family from aren't real at all, but it certainly makes it easier to call those things into question. This isn't like Fairly OddParents or Adventure Time, which focuses on children and their imaginations, and it's not some sort of metaphor for what we experience as humans, even if you could argue that the mind of Courage is somewhat like the mind of a child, but it really is just the story of a dog here. To some fans, this is why the show famously takes place in the isolated area called the middle of nowhere, as they refer to it. It's not because this place is in the middle of nowhere, but because as a dog, Courage has no idea where they actually are. If they even have just a little bit of land, which does seem to be the case, Courage might not be aware of the neighbors they do have just a little bit of ways. His home is all he knows or really remembers, and it seems huge to him because of that. To him, he and his family are lost in the middle of a great desert where strange people seem to come here and there out of nowhere, but really they're just people who live in the town surrounding him, and all the horrors could be in his head. In the very first episode even, the story of Courage is about how his own shadow comes to life and starts haunting him, setting the stage for the idea that what is really going on here is that this is a dog who is afraid of his own shadow, so to speak. And that's all the rest of the series is, a dog being scared of something that is essentially harmless, but which he interprets as bigger, darker, and scarier than it really is. Future episodes would have Courage being scared of people that aren't often seen as a threat to Muriel and Eustace, for instance, including visiting family members and strange traveling professionals who always seem to scare Courage even if maybe they shouldn't. Ultimately, it's a show about a dog who is terrified and who is paranoid, and this theory begs the question of whether or not all of this is just normal human interactions that Courage has been gaslit into thinking is true horror because of Eustace. And thus, when the problem inevitably solves itself by the character leaving, Courage gets to rationalize that he did something brave and heroic, just like a dog who barks at any visitor who comes over until they eventually leave of their own free will. Part 4, Rugrats. Now so far, all of these have been somewhat plausible theories, even if the Adventure Time one seemed a little lazy. At the very least, they all rely on taking supernatural elements and reinterpreting them in a way that makes it seem like everything is happening in our characters' heads. Among the most disturbing yet least plausible of these theories, however, is the Rugrats theory. And I have to warn you that this one's sad enough that if you're sensitive to the topics of birth and things going wrong with childbirth, maybe you should click away. Now, Rugrats is a show that is inherently about a child's imagination, including a system of play similar to that in Craig of the Creek. The kids tend to imagine things as being more fantastical than they are, and it's a shared form of play that even the people they have conflict with will often indulge in, particularly the character Angelica. With that in mind, you would think that there is nothing in the story that can be happening in one child's head that isn't already explicitly shown to be fantasy or imaginative play. However, one disturbing, albeit far-fetched theory is that the actual babies aren't real, or at least aren't alive, and that they're all just in Angelica's head. This is honestly, and I'm not saying this to be mean to whoever came up with this theory or to the people who like it, kind of the dumbest thing I have ever heard. But it also tickles that part of your brain that loves when something is extremely dark and is applied to something innocent from childhood. It's the same feeling you get when you realize that Little Red Riding Hood being chased by a wolf is not actually about being eaten by an animal, or that Ring Around the Rosies was actually about the plague. So, based on the rules of imaginative play, the Rugrats theory claims that Angelica is the only living child character in the main cast, with Angelica actually being old enough to talk, unlike the other babies. In Rugrats, the babies can talk with each other, and it's implied that younger children like Angelica understand adults, but also sort of a primal baby language that the babies are born knowing, the language of angels, if you will. But in this theory, the reason Angelica can talk to all the other babies is because they're actually imaginary characters in her head. When it comes to Tommy, this theory claims that he was brought to full term, but didn't survive the birthing process. This is somehow meant to explain why Stu is so focused on building children's toys, filling his time with projects he had started for a baby that would never come. Angelica, meanwhile, would have been told about this coming baby cousin of hers before it happened, and afterwards she would begin imagining that this child had survived the birth due to her inability to understand that kind of loss at a young age. Following this, she would begin to imagine other children who were no longer alive as well. Chucky's mother in the show was known to pass away sometime after Chucky had been born, with Chucky having some memories of his mother caring for him. But in the Angelica theory, it is claimed that Chucky's mother herself passed during childbirth, and Chucky passed with her. Then finally, there's the twins, Phil and Lil. In this theory, Betty's claimed to have become pregnant with just one child instead of twins. But for whatever reason, the theorists decided that Betty would choose to terminate the pregnancy. Angelica, meanwhile, wouldn't know if the baby was going to be a boy or a girl, and so she would just imagine twins, two versions of the same baby, one a boy and one a girl. Now, none of these really make sense with the actual characterizations of the adults in the show, and there's no hints of this in the narrative, and instead, it's more of a way to rationalize the one fantasy element that the show has, which is that it's from the perspective of babies, and babies aren't supposed to talk to each other. All of these claims about the true lives of the kids are interesting to bring up, but not to explore, as they just take key details about the characters and tries to twist them into something dark instead of revealing something dark that is actually there. But at the end of the day, it's why I think these theories are so popular. It's important to remember that shows like Rugrats could be scary, surreal, and mess with your mind. They had entire episodes about nightmares that still haunt me to this day, with the reveals of dreams within dreams in a way that makes Inception look absolutely boring in comparison. What I mean here is that there's always been an appeal in childhood to have these darker, more serious ideas behind the more innocent surface of the shows that we loved, because they tap into something that we already feel as children. Everything we're given in TV as children is sanitized in some way. We were the ones watching entertainment that we knew was for kids, and because of that, we knew that there was some sort of darker entertainment out there for adults. And a lot of us would imagine those as things being too scary for us to understand as kids. And that's why it's so popular to look back at some of these cartoons in particular and imagine the story all taking place in the characters' heads with some really dark twists. But what do you guys think? I don't like thinking, so I'll let you guys do that for me in the comments down below. And if you want me to dive more into one of these cartoons in particular, let me know in the comments as well. Writing this has really made me want to revisit Courage the Cowardly Dog, as I said, and even Rugrats for some reason. But let me know what you think I should make a video about next, and I'll see you guys next time. Happy Halloween!